tonight to have with us an old friend of the Institute, someone who has taught here before with great, the words are going to my mouth, aplomb, acclaim, all those good things. Ricardo Bayon is a very busy guy running around the world using money and markets to save the world, and that's what he's going to talk to us about tonight. He's from Encourage Capital, and before that, we have a long history in working on ecosystem services and using markets for conservation. So please join me in welcoming Ricardo this evening.
So I thought I'd do something slightly different for you guys today. I thought I'd do a sort of choose your own adventure kind of presentation. So I brought pretty much every slide presentation I have about a variety of different examples, and I will use the ones that I think are most interesting for you guys. So in order to do that, I need to find out a little bit more about what you guys already know about conservation finance, what your interests are. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and maybe you can raise your hand and we can take it from there. How many of you feel like you understand finance and economics? Okay. How many of you have worked perhaps in finance and economics, banking or something like that? Okay. How many of you understand things like carbon markets? All right. How about water markets?
Water.
So it seems like you guys are already pretty advanced. But for those of you who might not, it's okay, just stop me if I say something that is not, that you don't understand or that doesn't make sense. And I hope we can turn this into a bit more of a discussion and less of a sort of presentation from the podium. So again, feel free to stop me whenever you want. As Yuba knows that I can talk forever about ecosystem services, and I have at times, kind of gone on and on and on and on for hours at a time. So unless you stop me, it's going to go badly for you. So I got into finance and ecosystem services kind of a circuitous route. I started off with a big interest in environmental issues and how to protect the environment, and worked for many NGOs, including all the big names, TNC, IUCN, the World Conservation Union, and others. And it was when I was at IUCN, we would work all over the world, Africa, Asia, Latin America. And I remember specifically a couple of projects where we were working on protecting wetlands and forests. And we would raise money, and we would raise what we thought was a lot of money, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of dollars to work on protection and work with local communities and what have you. And at some point, somebody would come in with a development project that was huge, right? A dam or some sort of forestry project, and they would be spending millions of dollars upstream from us, basically making everything we did kind of obsolete. And I kept asking myself, how is this possible? Why? Why is it so easy to raise millions and billions of dollars to do something like a dam or a forestry project or what have you, and so hard to raise tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands to protect the environment? And I started asking myself, I'm in the wrong place. If I really want to protect landscapes, I got to get up there. I got to figure out how to channel that money in a different way, or else we're basically, fighting a losing battle. So, there was a famous bank robber. They asked him, why did you rob banks? And he said, because that's where the money is. And why? If you ask me, why did I become a banker? I'd say because that's where the money is, and because I think that the only way we are going to affect this change is through kind of moving those millions and billions and trillions of dollars in ways that are different than the way they're currently being moved, and into things that are perhaps better at the social, environmental level. So After that, I started to become basically, tried to educate myself on everything that had to do with money and finance and banking and all that stuff, from Adam Smith on up, all the way to sort of modern portfolio theory and all the rest of it. And I realized that part of the issue was what a lot of economists have been talking about for a long time, which is this concept of externalities, of the fact that we are not really seeing a huge chunk of this economic system in our financial models, in our accounts, in our economic system as a whole. So I started working on how do you bring these values in, and that's what led me to this whole concept of ecosystem services. But my timing was perfect because I basically started an impact investment bank. I became a banker in 2007, 2008, just when kind of the proverbial shit was hitting the fan, and I remember we were about to sign our first deal, and we were in London, and pen was about to meet paper, and we looked up, and the financial crisis, Lehman Brothers going under, and pen was promptly removed from paper, and everything kind of stopped. So my timing was perfect, and it kind of felt a little bit like this. My broker jumped out a window, but that's small consolation. So, when I think about kind of what it is that we're facing here, we're facing a situation where this is kind of like our planet today, and it feels like it's been colonized by a bunch of billions of spiders, because these are the shipping routes in blue, the air networks in white, and the roads in green. And there's every day less and less of that dark space. Less and less of those places where we don't have a major impact as humans, right? And when I look at that, I think to myself that if you try to value the services that these dark spots provide, and that just ecosystems generally provide, it would be huge. But the problem is that our financial system doesn't see it. And don't get me wrong, I don't think our financial system is evil or problematic, and I know that there's this whole new view, I think, that everything that has to do with capital and capital markets and economics and finance is evil and is the problem. I think, actually, that our financial system and our system of capital allocations is probably one of the most powerful tools ever invented by humans. And I think if you take nothing more from what I say today, think of that economic system, that financial system, as a tool we've built, as a machine we've built. Now, there's a problem with it, right? There's a problem in the sense that the world, when this machine was built, the world did not look like this. It was a very different world. And it was a world where what was scarce was capital and labor. Nature, natural systems, nature's services, animals and plants, that's not what was scarce. In fact, people would look out and see a swamp and think, it's a swamp, that's what we got to get rid of. That's the problem. That's the barrier to progress. And if you know nothing more about economic systems, you know that it's about supply and demand, right? And that's how prices are set. And since the supply of basically call them ecosystem services or nature services was high, and the demand was, perhaps not as big because people didn't see it, they didn't bother to think about where the clean air came from or the clean water came from. There wasn't enough people. We're talking about a time where you would read about people going out into the Great Plains and basically seeing buffalo as far as the eye could see, millions and millions. You couldn't shoot them fast enough. You couldn't kill them ever, right? And yet, here we are, they're mostly gone. Other stories of going out fishing in the Grand Banks, and basically to pull a cod, all you have to do is throw a bucket over and lift the bucket onto your boat. I mean, they were fishermen that used to say we could walk from our boats to the land practically on the backs of the cod, right? And so that was the world back then, right? And so what was scarce, again, was capital to raise that swamp, and labor and people, and we've moved into a very different system. We've moved into a world where that's not what's scarce. There's more than enough capital, more than enough people, more than enough labor, and these things that we took for granted that were basically the life support system of this huge planet spaceship that we're on, that's what's becoming more and more scarce. And it kind of feels like, you know, we're on this spaceship and we're taking apart the life support systems to sell them for pieces and for parts. So I started looking at sort of how this financial system works, and it's an incredible tool. It's the first, I think, the first kind of digitization mechanism machine that we ever built, because basically what it means is turning, you know, all these things we take for granted, coffee and water and food, into numbers, into a unit of value, into money, right? And that allowed it to flow in a way that it didn't flow before, and it allowed us to allocate that capital in a much more efficient way. We wouldn't be where we are today if we didn't have that capital allocation system, that system of aggregating value. The problem is that imagine if you were living in today's world and you were using not your current internet browser, but you were using Windows 95, right? And you had to get on the internet, and you're trying to do Twitter, and you're trying to do, you know, do YouTube and all that stuff. What would happen is you would get all that blue screen of death, if those of you old enough to remember it, a whole lot, because that system wasn't built for this world. And I think, you know, in the world of capital markets, in the world of finance, we're operating on call it capitalism 1795 or 1695, and we're trying to shoehorn the world of 2019 into that world, and it's just not working. We're running into trouble. So just to give you a couple of examples of how the demand has increased on these systems. This blew my mind when I read this a year or two ago. It says 75% of the infrastructure that will exist on the planet in 2050 has not yet been built. All right, so that map that I showed you of air routes, that's not even 25% of where we'll be in 30 years. Imagine that world. Imagine how we're going to be paving over these systems that are providing basically life support. Now imagine a world where there's more people and less natural systems providing that life support. What do you get? What happens? What happens is you have that flip in that scarcity value, right? And you go from a world where what's scarce is capital and labor to a world where, yeah, these natural systems and these ecosystem services, that's what's becoming scarce. And so I am trying to, if you want to summarize my entire career, it would be that I am trying to figure out how do we upgrade and patch that operating system of our economic life, you know, the capitalist system or whatever you want to call it, financial system, into a world where we can actually give value to all those things that do not have value. Because we could afford at one point to ignore the value of the insects that pollinate our crops. Because A, you know, we paid very little attention to it, there was more than enough of it, not a problem. You know, you could spread all the pesticides you wanted and, you know, okay, you'd kill a bunch of bees, but there was still enough to pollinate your crops. And again, fast forward to today, where what happens pretty much every spring in the Central Valley of California, do you realize that we ship in a huge proportion of the bees from the United States into California to pollinate our almond trees? We literally put them on trains and bring them to California, because otherwise there wouldn't be enough pollination of the almond crops in California. Now imagine that, and guess what we feed them on the way over? We feed them high fructose corn syrup, and then we wonder, you know, why we have problem with the bee populations across the country. on top of all the pesticides, on top of all the other stuff. So when I started in this business, what I started to do was say to myself, okay, how do we send the right signals into the market for it to begin to understand these systems? And that's how I got involved in carbon markets, because I saw them as a nascent system to put a value on an ecosystem service, call it, atmospheric capacity to absorb greenhouse gases, or whatever you want to call the service, but it was truly one of those services. And I started trying to understand how these markets are created, why are they created, what's the problem with them, can we get more of these markets for ecosystem services operating. And when I started, there was no carbon market. All there was a voluntary carbon market that had just begun. The first transactions had been done when I started looking at this. Now, we went through a bigger voluntary market. We went through a carbon market in Europe. We've gone to a carbon market now that's been operating for several years in California. And so I started producing information about these markets because I realized that one of the key insights that I saw in how markets develop is you need that kind of information. There's a reason why the Bloombergs of the world develop, is because in order to make transactions, you need to understand, what the bid and the ask is, and who's bidding what, and what the potential value is in order to have those transactions. So information is a key component of any market. So I started producing information about it, created a thing called the Ecosystem Marketplace, which is a news and information service on ecosystem markets, wrote books and papers on carbon markets, and did all of that. But then I realized that this is not going to be enough, and that there weren't enough people who understood finance and understood the environment in a way to actually make these transactions happen. And I also realized another key point, which was that the carbon market, like many of these ecosystem markets that were emerging, relied on one way of internalizing that economic externality, and that was literally government fiat, government decision to do that, right? Because the voluntary markets, they were great, but they were small, and they weren't really up to the task of addressing an issue like climate change. But it was only when, the European Union created a carbon market that we saw volumes that you started to think, okay, now we're talking about a potential solution at the scale of the problem that we're facing. But, we always talk about the free market and, get government out of market systems. Here's what I think, and you can challenge me if you don't agree with me, but I think that there is no such thing as a market free of government intervention. It doesn't exist. We need it in order to create the types of markets that we want. And even if you look at Wall Street and the Goldman Sachs of the world and the traditional financial markets, they operate as well as they do, or you can argue as badly as they do, in part because of the government systems that have been set up to let them operate. If you look back in history, when these markets were created, you had all kinds of shenanigans going on because there was no regulation, there was no regulator to imbue trust. And one fundamental principle that operates in no matter what market you talk about is you need trust in order to do transactions. In fact, it's ingrained in the language we use. The word credit comes from the Latin credere, to believe. If you do not believe you will get paid back, you do not lend money. If you do not believe that if I give you money or if I give you a sheep, I will get, meat or wood or whatever it is I want, then I'm not going to make that transaction. And the reason it took so long for these markets to develop was in part because there was no trust. There was no entity able to kind of make people live up to their contracts and make sure that people did the transactions they said they were doing. And that entity is, Hobbes's Leviathan. It's government. It's basically some entity big enough to enforce that sort of thing. So the reason we have the capital markets that we have, the reason that you can go out and feel comfortable putting your money into Apple's shares or Microsoft shares is because you have a Securities Exchange Commission out there that is supposedly, to some degree, you know, making sure that you're not being totally lied to, and that if you are lied to, you have recourse in some way of doing it. So, you know, there is an important aspect that government plays. And the problem with these environmental and ecosystem markets was that it went even further, the role of government. Because what was happening was you were taking a public good, which was the atmosphere, which before was, you know, suffering from that tragedy of the commons, that nobody owned it, so everybody was using their junk up there. And all of a sudden, when the carbon market was created, you had an entity like a government. In that case, first case, it was the European Union, basically saying, okay, we're going to put limits on your ability to emit. So how many of you know exactly how kind of carbon markets work? Or feel you know how carbon markets work? Okay, would it be worth talking a little bit about it?
Sure.
Okay. So, I mean, basically what you have in a carbon market is you have a sort of cap and trade system. And that comes from the fact that you have you're setting limits on the ability to emit. And so let's take the case of the EU when the European Union's carbon market was set up, and then we can talk about California market. And we at Encourage, we've invested in the carbon markets in California. We created a fund, an investment fund to invest in carbon for the California market. So I am happy to go into that if people are interested in how it worked and how it did and all of that. But basically the way the carbon market works is, imagine you have the European Union and it gets all of its emitters in the room around a table, and it says, okay, we're going to set limits on how much greenhouse gases you can put in the atmosphere. It used to be free, you used to be able to do whatever you wanted to, no more. We're exercising our governmental prerogative and we're saying there's going to be limits. And you, ExxonMobil, you've been emitting 20, we're going to lower you down to 15, we're going to give you the permits to emit 15. If you really want to emit 20, you got to find somebody else in the room who's willing to sell you 5 of their permits, i.e. they're going to emit less than they have permits for. And this is the core of a carbon market, is these allowances to emit carbon. There is an ancillary part of many of the carbon markets that are called offsets. And what that is the government saying, hey, there are people who are not in this room who could reduce emissions. We're going to give them the right to sell you these permits to emit, right? And we're going to set up rules for how they create a carbon reduction unit, and how they sell it to you. And each of the governments sets up that system slightly differently. California, the regulator is the Air Resources Board. They set up the protocols for what parts of the economy that are not in that room getting permits can create offsets to sell to the people in that room, right? So they set up these rules and regulations, and these systems work. And well, one interesting thing about cap and trade, and why I find it kind of a useful tool, is that what you end up getting is you're getting a system of incentives and disincentives when you do this, right? The incentive is to emit less, because all of a sudden your carbon has value. It didn't have value before. Now it has a certain value that's being set by the market. So if it's costing you $10 a ton and you're emitting 1 million tons, that's $10 million. And you know, the businesses are not in the habit, or don't like to throw millions of dollars out the window, so they tell their people, how do we reduce? How do we not waste those $10 million? How do we reduce and sell our surplus to somebody else? So it's an incentive to reduce and a disincentive to emit. And it, you know, in theory, it works great, right? Practice was a little bit difficult, and there's a fascinating story of what happened when the carbon market was first set up in Europe. So imagine, what do you think would happen if all of you guys represent a major emitter in the European Union. And all of you, just to make up a number, together are emitting 1,000 tons. And you're ExxonMobil, you were emitting 150, and now I tell you, you're going to reduce to 120. What do you think was the response from industry when that happened?
Oh, boy.
They weren't happy. And more than that, they were like, you guys are crazy. You're going to lower us to 1,000? We can't live with 1,000. 1,000 is way too low a number. We think we're emitting at least 3,000, right? Because remember, nobody was monitoring this yet. So there was no data. We didn't know exactly what those numbers were. Part of the process was setting up monitoring for all these emissions so the government could keep track of what was being emitted. But right when the system was being set up, nobody knew. So, they said, no, you're crazy. Like, maybe we could live at 2,500. So government said, well, fine, we'll split the difference. Let's go to 2,000 or 1,500. So the market, when it started, it was fascinating because, the price of carbon went up and up and up and up and up. Why? Because the market thought, hey, they need 3,000. They've only got 2,000. This market is short carbon. It's worth something. Lo and behold, a year into the system, once the emissions were starting to return numbers, guess what happened? Not only could they have lived with 1,500, but they probably could have lived with the 1,000 that was originally proposed. And so what happened the next day after these numbers were released into the market? The price of carbon plummeted, right? Billions of dollars were lost in value in the carbon market. And by then, after a year and some of trading, it wasn't Greenpeace that was buying carbon. This was all the major banks in Europe. HSBC, it was JP Morgan, Citigroup, all of these big financial firms had been involved in the carbon market, and oil companies and oil traders, and everybody was trading carbon. And there had emerged a sort of carbon world of finance that included traders, and included brokers, and included everything that you can imagine when you have a new commodity that has been created. And this is what happened, a new commodity was created. So the prices plummeted, and I remember reading the news here in certain circles in the US is like, see, carbon markets don't work, they failed, the prices plummeted, it doesn't work. The truth was, they were working. It was just that the data was wrong. And in fact, the interesting thing is that when California then came and created its own market, guess what they did? They didn't cave so easily when industry said, no, we can't live with that. And in fact, they said, no, you know what, we're going to start. First, we're going to have a couple of years of putting in the measuring to figure out exactly what's being emitted before we start to set the cap limit. So, they learned from the European. They had advisors who had created the European market, advising them on how to potentially create the carbon market. So these things evolved, and the carbon market in California is now relatively robust. And when California was creating their market, we saw an opportunity because we had seen and we had watched the European market, and we saw an opportunity in investing in those offsets that we were talking about. California had already signaled that it was going to allow the forestry sector to sell offsets, i.e. if you maintained, protected, or planted forests that would sequester carbon, California was going to give you credit for that in the carbon market. So we went out, we raised a couple of $1 million to invest in projects that would create these carbon emission reductions offsets to sell into the California market. Now, we were taking a bit of a risk because we didn't know exactly what the California carbon market was going to look like. But in the end, we raised $1 not a huge amount, about $4 or $5 million to invest in this. And we put it to work over the next 6-7 years. At the end of the day, we did about a 40% IRR on admittedly a low number. Does that mean anything to people? 40% IRR, it's an internal rate of return. That is pretty good. It was probably the best investment that some of our investors made that year out of everything they invested in. And it was funny to see them get their checks because they were like, wait, what? This was an impact investment. I thought you weren't going to make money. What's going on here? And we're like, no, we told you. We think if this works, you could make money and you'd be supporting, projects that are good on the environmental side as well. So, yeah, we 3x'd some of their money from this investment. And the reason was we got in early, essentially, in this market.
Ask you, who is providing these offsets that you bought? Who are the entities that have the offsets that you purchased?
So California did an interesting thing when it created its system. So remember that I said that people who were not in that room getting allowances could also sell into the market. These are called offsets. California set up a system of offsets, and the first protocol they created was a forestry protocol that had 3 categories of forestry projects that would be allowed. One is called improved forest management, which is basically saying, I was managing my forest like this, and it was maintaining X tons of carbon in the forest. I'm going to manage it differently, change the rotations, do different things, and now I'm going to have X plus Y. Give me credit for the Y tons. California also said that we will allow forestry projects from all over the United States, not just California, to sell offsets into the California market. The thinking was, this will show that carbon markets can work. This will also create people in Arkansas and Missouri and Alaska and Oregon and elsewhere that have an interest in the carbon market and may be pushing for carbon markets in other states, so that California isn't the only state with a carbon market, and hopefully one day we may have a federal, national carbon market. Now that was before all the things that happened politically, but that was kind of the thinking there. So to answer your question about who the people are, we went out and looked for landowners who were able to manage their forests differently. And we worked with them to set up new management plans and write a proposal to get carbon for the California market. And it's not a simple process. The way it works is you have to actually meet a certain protocol. The California Air Resources Board wrote rules about how a project gets carbon credits, and there are formulas and there are all kinds of approaches that you have to measure how many trees are on the land, what the changes are, and that gives you a formula of how much carbon you can get. And then you have to have it verified by an approved third-party entity called, these verification companies. So it can be expensive to do a carbon project. But we worked with some big landowners, including a Native American tribe in Arizona, which had 150,000 acres that we helped create a carbon project on.
Were they active loggers?
They were loggers, and what they did was change the way they managed the forest and agreed to maintain a certain amount of carbon on that land for 100 years. So they had the potential to log much more than they're currently logging, and so they're logging differently, but in return, they got from that project about $30 million in carbon value. And in fact, that money was instrumental in keeping them solvent for a few more years, and they invested it in schools and other things. So it had knock-on value. We also worked with a large TIMO, a Timber Investment Management Organization, on another project about 80,000 acres. Again, about $30 to $40 million in value for the landowner. And what the agreement we made with the landowner was, we will do all the work, do the inventory of the trees, pay for the inventory of the trees, prepare the proposal for California because we know how to do it, pay for the verification, and in return, we'll take a percentage of the credits that we generate. You keep 80 or 90%, we'll take, 10 to 20% depending on the size of the project. So that was kind of the deal we made with landowners. And it was highly profitable, and there's still carbon projects being done. We returned all the money to the investors, so that fund closed. But we created a company basically to do the same thing, because we still think there's value out there. We're currently investing money from that company, which we basically sold shares, sold equity in the company to raise the money to invest in these projects. And so we were invested in a couple of projects.
What kind of return did the investors get back?
In that company?
Yeah.
Well,
They did get their money back, but and it's some percentage in excess.
well, in the fund, they did 40% IRR net of fees.
Okay.
So that's triple their money in 7 years,
Where
which
did that
is
come
huge.
from? Where did that, where
It was
did you
basically, we were spending, call it $500,000 to $1 million to actually generate a project with a landowner. We were then getting 10% of the credits, which we were selling for 2x, 3x, 4x.
Well,
the
that's what
money
I'm
spent.
asking, did the value of the credits go up over the life of the project? Is that where the returns came from?
Yeah, but that wasn't where, it did, but that wasn't where we were making our money, because what we were doing was we were generating the credits at a low price, so we weren't buying the credits, we were generating the credits, and then selling the credits at the market value. So it was the delta between what it cost to generate the credits and what we sold the credits for. So, you could go in and buy carbon tomorrow and hope that the price goes up and make money, and there are people that are doing that, and basically, traders in carbon, that's another strategy. That was not our strategy in that particular fund. And like us, there's several other groups that are doing that kind of thing on carbon. Yeah.
The bulk of the returns earned by the fund investors or by the equity investors? I think that was the question this gentleman might have been getting at.
No, there's two entities. So first we created a fund. There was no equity investors. There was a LP GP structure, so a limited partner and a general partner. We were the general partner. Limited partners were the investors. The limited partners got all the returns, and that's the 40% IRR net of fees. They got 40% return on their money, 3x their money. We made carry on that, and a pretty significant amount of carry for the GP, so that's where we made money. After we created that fund, returned all the money, then what we said is, should we create another fund? And the problem we had was that in order to raise a fund, what we needed to have was something where we could deploy, call it $50 to $100 million. And we felt this opportunity, if it was going to be us deploying $50 to $100 million in $1 million investments, the transaction costs would be too high to create a $50 to $100 million fund. So rather than create a fund as a follow-on to that first fund, what we did was we created a company. And then we sold equity in the company. Those investors have not made anything yet. So they've just owned equity in the company. When the company makes money, we give the money back in two ways. One is dividends. If the company continues, they can sell their shares to somebody else. That's how those equity investors in the company will make money. But that's different than the fund. Is that
a Reg D company, or it's not publicly listed?
No.
It's
It's a
Reg D.
privately held company, yeah.
Ricardo, is this common in were you guys just extremely skilled, or are there high returns in these offset projects?
I think we came in early in a market that we felt was going to develop and was going to develop in a robust way, because we had confidence that California had learned the mistakes of Europe, and that ARB was a serious regulator with somebody at its head, a woman named Mary Nichols, who was serious about creating this carbon market in a way that was going to work. So we took that risk on investing in carbon ahead of the market creation, and I think that explains a chunk of our returns. if we were to do the exact same thing today, A, we would have more competition from others trying to do this, so they would push the prices down. So I think our returns, if we were to do it starting now, would be less than the 40% IRR we made. Because there's more competition, because the landowners now see the value in it. The other thing that we faced was landowners didn't believe us. When we said there was going to be a carbon market in California, they're going to pay you to maintain carbon in trees. They looked at us as if we were crazy. And I think the people that actually did the project with us still thought we were crazy, but they were like, okay, there's no money from us. So if it works, great. If it doesn't work, no skin off our back, right? That was the only reason they did it, to be frank. Because they were as surprised as our investors to see that this was for real. The interesting thing about that fund was that it had two types of investors. On the one hand, it had high net worth individuals and family offices. In other words, they had people with basically very rich people who were putting their money in, and what you might call a traditional impact investor put up half the money, I would say. The other half of the money came from a big oil company who was realizing that they were going to be subject to the California carbon market, and they thought, what's a couple of $1 million as a hedge? If this works, we may lose money in being imposed carbon standards, but we may make money in this fund. So they were hedging a little bit, and they saw us as a way to learn about how the California carbon market was developed. So it was those two types of people, which is another interesting thing that happens when you create a market like this, is you create a whole set of different interests in this. And one of the fascinating things about Europe, remember I told you that the price crashed? Basically, the day after that price crashed, guess who was knocking at the doors of the regulators for the carbon market in Europe, saying, guys, you set up this market all wrong. You need to tighten here. You need to it was not Greenpeace, it was Goldman Sachs, it was Morgan Stanley, it was HSBC, it was some of these big players who were basically coming in and saying, you need to do this. So it creates a whole nother dynamic in terms of regulation, because all of a sudden carbon has a value, and there are people invested on all sides of that value chain. Now, we haven't seen a huge amount of other markets like this created. I think carbon is unique. It's not the only one. There are others that are out there. So mitigation banking is an interesting one here in the United States. So basically what you have is wetlands that are protected, federally protected wetlands under the Clean Water Act. There's a system whereby you can basically trade wetland mitigation credits in the U.S. And it's an interesting system that I can go into if there's interest. Water is a whole nother ballgame, very, very differently. I think water is going to be a really interesting one to watch, particularly in California, for all the reasons that you can imagine, in terms of drought, in terms of value, in terms of ecosystem services. There was an original market that was created in sulfur dioxide. It was one of the first, even before the European carbon market here in the US, and that was to deal with acid rain. That was probably the first market of this sort, the cap and trade market ever created here in the world. It was here in the US. And so there's several others out there, but the problem is that it requires regulation. The reason there's a carbon market in California is that there's a regulator who has said, thou shalt not emit, because nobody wakes up in the morning wanting a bowl of carbon. So creating carbon as a commodity, you need to create that artificial scarcity, and it's government that creates that scarcity. Now, we are living in a political system now here in this country where there is, a wholesale denial that we need regulation practically. And so in that environment, it's very hard to imagine creation of these types of ecosystem service markets. And so we've actually kind of shifted a little bit and asked ourselves, where are things going, and how will the the value of ecosystem services really be incorporated in the economic system in a world where you don't have government doing what California did for carbon. What does that look like? And how does that work? And one of the interesting things we did, because how many of you have heard the term impact investing and feel you understand what that means? So we're an impact investment firm in a way. We try to deploy money in ways that generate social environmental impact at the same time that it generates financial returns. And it's fascinating going to talk to providers of capital and providers of money. When you say impact investment, they immediately think in their heads, oh, you're going to lose money, right? Compared to anybody else. Because if you're doing impact, that means you're giving up something somewhere, right? And I think that's a myth. That can happen. Doesn't have to happen. And there are investments like this carbon investment that we created where you can actually make money and do things that have an impact. But what we saw was that two things that are important. That the world of impact investing is growing and growing at a really rapid clip. And I think it has to do with a lot of different trends out there. I think one of the biggest and most interesting trend is that we are now in the midst of probably the greatest transfer of wealth from one generation to the other in human history. Some estimates say, maybe it's close to, 20, 30 trillion dollars that are going to transfer from one generation to the next, basically as the baby boomer money transfers to the next generation or the millennials. And when money changes managers, management tends to change. Management of the money tends to change. And what we're seeing is that new generation is asking itself, how do I do, many of them are very wealthy. They have more than enough money to put their kids through college, to pay their mortgages, or own their houses, or whatever. But they're asking themselves, okay, well, how do I put a portion of it at least in something that I can feel good about, and something that I can say is having an impact? And we're seeing a lot of this happen. We're being approached by all of the big banks about impact investing. Goldman Sachs bought an impact investment firm not too long ago. All of the major banks now have impact investment divisions or players, and they're not doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing it because their clients are asking, what can you offer me that has an impact? But the problem, the way we created our firm and the way when we created Encourage, what we realized was that approach to impact investing, the way it was being managed, that transition, was being managed in a way where they were kind of taking a very traditional investment mindset and layering impact almost as an afterthought. So they would go, I invest in private equity or venture capital or what have you. How do I layer impact into what I'm already doing? And we felt that for impact investing to really reach its potential, you got to actually approach it the other way around. You got to ask yourself and say, what is the impact you want to have? What do you care about? Do you care about, plastics in the ocean, fish going, extinct, or do you care about social issues? And then you just find, how do you invest in ways that make money and address that problem? Where are the key places where you can move the log jams in order to achieve that impact through investment capital? And since we were basically people who understood investment and people who understood some of these issues, it felt like this is something that we could do and bring that together. And one of the interesting observations I make is that when we started the firm back in 2007, 2008, we kind of had trouble hiring people that had that dual vision. So we ended up having to hire people who understood environmental issues or social issues, and then hire people who understood banking or finance, right? And we tried to get them to work together in a team. That has changed in a really radical way, I find. The people that are applying for jobs with us now actually have both these skill sets. So I think that's something that gives me hope. But the way we approached the impact investment universe was we said to ourselves, what is the impact you want to have? What is the issue you care about? And then let's design investment approaches that address that issue and also make you money. So one of the first times we tried this was we were approached by the Walton Foundation, who had been spending a lot of money on the Colorado River and Western water. And they were like, we've been spending a lot of money on philanthropy to save the Colorado River, but no amount of philanthropy is going to solve this problem. This is too big and too difficult a problem. We know that unless we bring and mobilize private capital in some way, this is not going to happen. Can you give us a sense of what our options might be? We said, maybe, but we don't really understand issues of the Colorado River. And they're like, okay, no problem. We will team you up with people who understand the Colorado River and water in the West, and you guys understand the finance, and you guys work together and produce something. So we actually ended up working with some of the leading experts on water in the West and the Colorado River, and some lawyers who really knew where all the bodies were buried in terms of water rights and all this other stuff. And after a couple of years, we produced a report called Liquid Assets, which had about a dozen ideas of how you might invest in ways that could address the problems of the Colorado River. So rather than say, I invest in private equity, how do I layer impact into what I'm already investing in? We said, okay, well, what's the problem of the Colorado River? How do you address that problem through investment? And where are there ways to make investments? That report is public. You can get it on our website. And as I said, there's about a dozen ideas there that range from ideas that we think will not produce huge returns, maybe sort of 1%, 2% returns, but could be impactful, all the way to ideas that are both impactful and can produce returns. And since that report, we've been trying to raise capital to basically implement two of those ideas. And I'll tell you a little bit about them. So one of them has to do with the fact that the majority of the water of the Colorado River goes to ranching and agriculture, something on the order of 70 to 80%. So if you're going to truly address issues of water in the Colorado River, you've got to address the way agriculture and ranching is done in the Colorado Basin. So as some of you probably already know, the Colorado River no longer reaches the ocean. Right? It is basically used up before it hits the ocean. And there's a huge delta in Mexico that no longer flows and hasn't flowed since like 1970. Because every drop of water in the Colorado River is used at least 5 times before it even crosses the border into Mexico. And it doesn't cross a whole lot of it. It doesn't cross into Mexico. And in fact, that delta has only reached the ocean. The water has only reached the ocean twice in the last 20 years. And that was because a couple of foundations put up money to essentially buy the water to allow it to reach the ocean in Mexico. And it was like an event in Mexico with, the water kind of starting to flow down into the delta and birds starting to like, oh my God, there's water. No way. So what we did on ranching is we said, look, a huge problem with the Colorado River is that the system of water rights is totally and royally messed up. Like you couldn't design a worse system for water efficiency if you tried. Okay? You have a system that was created basically from the pioneer days practically, where it's first in use is first in right. So basically, whoever got there first claimed the water right, and then everybody else kind of has subservient or subsequent rights to it. So whatever is left, you can use. And let's say you're a farmer and you have some of these early water rights. If you don't use the water, you lose that right, and it goes to the next person in the hierarchy. So guess what the incentive is if you're a farmer? It's to use it or lose it, basically, is what you have in a desert. And that's why you get crazy things happening, like, there are parts in Southern California, kind of on the border of Mexico in the Imperial Valley, where we are flood irrigating alfalfa in 100-degree weather of the desert in Colorado River. That part of California is the single biggest user of Colorado River water in the entire basin, basically. Flood irrigating alfalfa. Why? Because it's cheaper to send alfalfa from the Imperial Valley to China than it is to send it from the Imperial Valley to San Francisco. Basically all those huge boats that come over from China full of iPads and other things go back empty. So it's no skin off their back to put some alfalfa and take it back. So they basically charge almost nothing to take the alfalfa back, right? So it's a crazy system of water rights. And what we wrote in the report is like, look, if you really wanted to solve the water problems of the Colorado River, we would have to change that system. That system is so entrenched, so politically difficult to change, because the people who have to change it are the people who own the rights, or you have to have a government willing to come in there and say, everything that was before is no longer, we're doing things completely different. We don't see that kind of government happening anytime soon, and we don't think the people who own those water rights are going to decide themselves to change it. So let's assume that those system of water rights is not going to change. How could you actually invest and make a difference in that kind of world? And so what we realize is that there is probably a way to either work with farmers or buy farming and transition those farms from, call it, low-value, high-water use crops like alfalfa to high-value, low-water use crops and there are millions, from dates to a crazy rubber substitute called guayule to, there's a lot you could probably do. So we are exploring an investment strategy that does that basically buys land, and our models show that we could make a higher return on that real estate than you would with a traditional approach to buying real estate. And you could also have an impact on the water and the water rights. And if you wanted to juice those returns even further, you could probably sell your excess water rights if you owned enough of the land to be able to work with other landowners to sell. It's a complicated approach. Yeah.
What you're proposing really is disentangling the value of the water from the use of the land, whereas traditionally the water rights model kept it tied to the land. In this case, if the land isn't using the water, don't you lose the water rights?
Well, there are certain parts of the Colorado River where you can actually enter into agreements where you can lease that water and not lose the water rights. So you're still considered as having a beneficial use, but it's not everywhere in the Colorado, and you need to know where. And you need to make those investments in the right places, unless the systems change. There is, don't get me wrong, there is change happening, particularly here in California. Because one of the other things that's crazy about the way these systems were set up is that we've treated groundwater and surface water as if they were two separate systems. So basically, groundwater is not regulated, and as long as you can put a pump down, you can take groundwater out. And the only reason California survived the sort of 6-year drought we just came out of was because we pumped a hell of a lot of groundwater out. California now has instituted a system to begin to monitor and regulate groundwater. It's called SGMA, the California Groundwater Management Act. It is unclear how SGMA will impact the economic system in California, but what you can be certain of is that it will impact the economic system in a big way. Already, we are seeing, some interesting things going on in terms of how land that has good groundwater is valued versus land that doesn't have good groundwater. And we foresee a time when there's going to be some interesting trades where basically bad land with good water is going to make a deal with good land with bad water rights, and the system is going to work in interesting ways. we're trying to figure out if there's investment opportunities. We're not the only ones. There's a lot of people. This is billions of dollars worth of value that is starting to percolate into the system in terms of what that groundwater is worth. We are looking with cities of groundwater recharge projects, which we think could make money and are going to be probably the way we solve some of California's groundwater and water problems in the long run. In fact, LA survived this drought because they had already begun a very aggressive program of recharging water into the groundwater. So basically, you know, all these aquifers that have been pumped, they're starting to create wells to pump it back down and store it there. So, you know, the way you solve the water problem of a place like California, an arid place like California, is that you have to do what I think of as slow the flow. It's essentially what you have is you have a system where you got a lot of rain coming in certain times of the year, and it's like overwhelming the system, depositing a snow. So that's, you know, your reservoir, and then it can flow out to the ocean. Unless we figure out a way to, you know, in theory, the cycle it goes to the ocean, it goes back into the rain, and it comes back. But that cycle takes thousands, if not millions of years. A, we have to speed up that cycle, and B, we have to slow the flow so that keep that water circulating in little cycles at the local level. And that's how we're going to solve this problem. The other thing we're going to have to get used to is that we're going to be drinking treated sewage. It's already happening in a lot of places, and it's going to be happening here. There's no, I mean, I've looked at the numbers. There is no other solution with our populations. Either we get rid of a huge amount of people, or we start drinking sewage, because there's no other approach possible. Yeah, and you know, there are pilot plants that are doing it already in California.
East Bay Mud is good.
Yeah, East Bay Mud has it, LA has it, everybody's trying it, but you know, our regulations don't permit it to happen yet, but it will eventually. We're gonna have to. It's crazy because what our regulations allow is they allow a sewage treatment plant to, you know, treat the sewage, put the water in the river, and then somebody downstream taking that water out. That's okay. But if you try to, you know, take it before it goes in the river, that's legally not okay. And it's, you know, we're gonna have to get out beyond that yuck factor of the fact that treated sewage is water. It's, you know, it just is. But anyway, I digress. So anyway, we are trying to make these investments in this land to figure out a way to, as you said, kind of dissociate the water rights and the water value from the land value, but also grow crops that are probably more suited and better suited for the environments they're being grown in, because you know, we have some very high water use crops that are being grown in some very arid parts of our country, which, you know, makes zero sense.
Is there a generational issue there? Do you see some sort of a younger, farm-oriented, sustainable agriculture-oriented kind of market as some of the older farmers perhaps retire or hand over their property or not?
Yeah, I think there is some of that happening, and that's another issue that we've been talking to some people about how you might solve, because part of the problem is that younger generation doesn't have capital or land. So
They got vision, though.
they got vision and they got, you know, willingness, but they don't. They don't have the capital and the land, and the people who do have the capital and the land don't have the vision. So, you know, how do you change that around? And there are groups that are trying to address this. There's a group called Iroquois Valley Farms, which is basically what they do is they lend the capital to these young farmers who want to do things differently and sustainably, and they basically work in order to pay back that debt until they own the land themselves. And you know, they're not projecting huge returns for their investors, but I think they're doing sort of 4%, 5% maybe.
Just kind of circling back, could you first see a return in carbon farming, in soil sequestration? And mean, especially in California that
Yeah.
has, you know, the targets, our 2050 targets, or do you see any of that emerging?
We've done a lot of talk about it so far. We have not yet set up the mechanisms for that to actually work. So one of the interesting things, when we created our carbon fund, part of that money from that carbon fund was to be basically invested in agriculture, soil carbon. We gave that money back to the investors because we said, we don't think we can make money investing in soil carbon yet. And the reason we don't think we can do it is because the rules and regulations about what constitutes a carbon credit from a farming soil carbon perspective have not yet been written. And we don't think they're going to be written for at least 4 or 5 years. And that was 6, 7 years ago, and we're still not there yet. So I think we did the right thing in returning that money to the investors. I think theoretically it's possible, and I would love to see that happen, partly because, and we actually helped create an entity called the Coalition on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases, CAG, which was a coalition of farmers, carbon traders, soil scientists, and others to sort of begin to tackle this issue. Because it makes so much sense, you know. The greenhouse gases that are a part of agriculture, there's 3 basic ones. It's carbon dioxide, it's methane, and it's nitrous oxide. So carbon dioxide, you know, you all are pretty familiar with. We know how to deal with that. You know, that carbon basically gets stored in organic matter in the plant. So storing it in the plant is greater yield, stronger plant for the farmer, and it's pulling it out of the atmosphere. So you would think, intuitively, the interests are aligned, right? Methane, a little bit more tricky. I mean, we know how to measure carbon and we know how to figure it out. If the issue was just carbon, I don't think we would have as big a problem as we do now, because we can measure soil organic carbon, we can measure carbon content in the plants. We know that if it's in the soil and if it increases, it came from the atmosphere, so we know it's being sequestered. Those measurements, you know, we have robust protocols for taking samples and saying, we know how much carbon is being sequestered on this agricultural farm. The problem is, methane is trickier and nitrous oxide is brutally difficult. Because nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas that is several thousand times more powerful than carbon. So emitting 1 ton of nitrous oxide kind of cancels several thousand tons of sequestration of carbon dioxide. And the problem with nitrous oxide is that it's basically, if you fertilize with nitrogen, which is kind of generally what happens, that can lead to increased nitrous oxide emissions. And on top of it, it's a very complex biological, biochemical cycle that is impacted by temperature, humidity, and all kinds of other variables, such that you might have 1 acre of land not emitting anything, and another acre emitting lots of tons. So it's not like we could sample that 1 acre and say, this is what the emission is. We would have to sample a whole lot more. And sampling is expensive for nitrous oxide. So it's a tricky problem, and the way they're trying to solve it is by modeling. So they're trying to understand the biogeochemical system well enough to model, if I do this on the land, this is how much, and the temperature is this, and the humidity is this is how much nitrous oxide will be emitted. But you have to imagine that since we're not sampling, we're modeling, we're basically guessing, ground truthing those guesses. There's a lot of concern about should we allow this as part of the carbon trading regime or not. So there's a lot of complications. I'm not saying we're not going to solve them. I think we will, but it's going to take a while. It's going to be hard. But there's a lot of people doing some cool stuff. I mean, there's a Marin carbon project up near me who for many years, basically, what they've done is taken compost and applied it to rangeland and tried to measure carbon and the impact that has on carbon. And what they found was it's a huge impact, not only in terms of less methane emissions from the trash once it's composted, but also building the soil organic matter and basically restarting a kind of carbon pump in the grasses. The grasses start pumping carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, start storing it in their roots, and they've been measuring samples for now over a decade and have seen huge increases in carbon in the soil. So we're getting the data and the track record to be able to get there, but it's a tough.
Yeah. A couple years ago, I did a study for Lloyd's of London on innovative financing for coastal adaptation and sea level rise. In that study, I looked at the insurance industry, and I also looked at impact investing, and kind of said that impact investing was not there yet for investing in coastal resilience, but it might get there at one point. It certainly had a lot of promise. The general idea was consistent with increasing coastal resilience. I wonder if you are aware of anything that has any progress that has been made over the last couple of years in finding impact investing opportunities in coastal resilience of one kind or another.
So there's a pilot project that I think is it EDF? I think it's EDF or NRDC that are doing in Louisiana, specifically on how do you create ecosystems for coastal resilience there. They're trying to set up structures that are sort of pay for performance structures.
That's what I was trying to get at.
They haven't yet done it, but that just started, I think, 6 months ago, so kind of watch that space. They're trying to do that. There's been a lot of studies of how, if you install oyster reefs in some places, you can prevent kind of erosion in a much better way than by putting up a seawall, because basically the oyster reefs build themselves and lead to that sort of protection. I haven't seen anybody turn that into an investment opportunity or work with the insurance side. We were involved, speaking of insurance, we were involved in a project that is now called the Forest Resilience Bond, and it was to address forest fires in California, where you have a similar dynamic at play. And the pilot for that is just being launched up in the Tahoe National Forest, and there's an insurance investor that has come in to that structure, but it's very small and it's still in a pilot scheme approach. So to tell you the story of this fire resilience bond, because I think it'll get at some ways, innovative ways that you might address this problem, is we started looking at what was happening with the Forest Service and with fire fighting, and we started seeing that basically, right now, the percentage of the U.S. Forest Service's budget that goes to fighting fires has surpassed 50%, and is expected to hit 70 to 80% of the Forest Service's budget within the next 15 to 20 years. And we noticed that there was a real death spiral that the Forest Service was in, which was basically, I'm simplifying here, but they set up two pots of money. One pot is for fire prevention, and the other pot is for firefighting. And every year, the firefighting budget was bigger than expected, and they had to borrow money from the fire prevention budget to pay for the firefighting. So it was a vicious cycle, because next year would be worse, and the next year would be worse, and then Congress would allocate more, but then a bigger portion of the budget would get eaten up. So we asked ourselves, there are financial mechanisms you could imagine that do the reverse, that borrow from future firefighting to pay for fire prevention today. So we said, hey, wouldn't it be cool if you would set up a mechanism where basically you get a private investor to come in and say, I will do the fire prevention, and let's say it costs me $100, if I'm successful and I prevent the fires for you, government, then you pay me 110. Right? You're turning that vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle. And so we started talking to the Forest Service, and we started talking to a bunch of people, and ultimately we couldn't do it exactly like we wanted to, partly because there is no legal mechanism. It would take an act of Congress for the Forest Service to enter into a contract like that, to pay for, services in the future. So we're like, okay, how else could we skin this cat? And we worked with some graduates of the Berkeley School of Management who put the proposal for this forest resilience bond up for a business school proposal or competition with Morgan Stanley. They won the competition with this idea, and we helped them find money to create a company called Blue Forest that would basically do this pilot. And the way we tweaked it was we said, okay, you can't pay for things that are happening in the future, but you can pay for forest management today, right? What if we could make it cheaper for you? And the way we're going to make it cheaper for you is we're going to see what are the other benefits that forest management delivers. What are the other ecosystem services that it delivers? And one of the big ones is water savings. There's the potential for carbon in the carbon markets, but there is no protocol for fire carbon yet. There's a couple of people working on it, so we couldn't figure out a way to get money today for that, but maybe in the future. But water, we went and talked to a couple of utilities and said, hey, would you pay to do forest treatment in order to get more water and to prevent siltation and to prevent fires that are going to impact your structures? And if, part of the big issue that happens when there's a fire is that you have greater erosion and greater siltation of their dams and all that. It just messes their equipment in a big way. So they were like, yeah, we could throw money into that. So then we went to the Forest Service and we said, okay, so let's say it costs you $100 an acre to do the fire treatment. What if you pay us $80 an acre and the municipal utility pays us $30 an acre? All of a sudden we can borrow money from private investors to pay the 100 and pay them back 110 down the line. So we're doing this. There's a pilot project in the Tahoe. One of the investors that came in was an insurance company, basically because they're insuring for fire, and after the fire seasons that we've had, they're like, this is great PR, absolutely, count us in for some money. And so that pilot's happening. If that works, this could be $1 billion of these types of, they're not really bonds, they're kind of, they're a strange structure, but we call them a fire resilience bond, and all of the information on that is public as well, so if people are interested.
It was really interesting. I came up with a similar idea for, because the National Flood Insurance Program has exactly the same problem, but different mechanisms than the one you suggested. So those fire resilience bonds maybe inspired me to go back and look at my idea for how to capitalize the community investment savings to raise money to do prevention mitigation.
And we're also taking a similar idea into cities, and we've begun working with the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission on what we're calling a joint benefits authority concept. And this idea is that there's a lot of people telling utilities in cities that they need to build green infrastructure to deal with two problems. One of them is flooding, and the other one is stormwater management. Because what happens in many cities, including San Francisco, is that we have combined sewer systems. So when there are big storms, all that water enters the sewer system, overruns the capacity of the sewage treatment plant to actually treat that water. And so basically it gets dumped into rivers, oceans, whatever, right? This is regulated by the Clean Water Act in some places, and there are some cities in the US which are under consent decree from the government saying you're gonna fix this problem or we're gonna charge you huge amounts of money. If you build parks and green infrastructure, these natural systems, ecosystem services, basically uptake that water, slow the flow of that water so it doesn't enter the sewer system, so you can help address that problem. And we've been banging our head against the wall of many of these utilities saying you should build more green infrastructure, you should build more parks, more permeable pavement, you should do things that prevent that stormwater from actually entering into your sewer system. And they go, yeah, we'd love to, but actually it's probably for us, if you just look at the water management side of things, it's more expensive than just building a huge underground treatment tank. Never mind that, park would be better for the community, it would create jobs, it would be, a better solution. And plus, it addresses heat island effects, it sequesters carbon, it increases biodiversity, and they go, yeah, but we don't care about any of the other stuff. All we're charged with is managing water. That is all we can think about. In fact, it's illegal for us to put money for anything that doesn't have to do with managing water. So we cannot put money into something like that. So we're like, okay, how about if we brought in the Parks Service, the Parks Department, the Transportation Department, and a few others, and they pay for the transportation benefits, the parks pays for the parks benefits, you pay for the water benefits. Instead of it costing you 100, now it's costing you 60, and transportation's paying 30, and parks is paying 20. All of a sudden we've got 110, we can borrow money, do the work, get paid back. Haven't done it yet, but SFPUC said, yeah, if you do that, we're in. And if you get, MTA or somebody else to pitch in, we're all in. So we're now in discussions with MTA, with others, and I don't know how familiar you guys are with a concept called the Joint Powers Authority. So basically, when two jurisdictions want to work together on, say, a sewage treatment plant, they create what's called a Joint Powers Authority. So say the County of Sonoma wants to work with the County of Napa to create a sewage treatment plant. Neither of them can legally, spend money in the other county. So what they do is they create a Joint Powers Authority where they each contribute a portion to, and that Joint Powers Authority creates the sewage treatment plant, and they each pay whatever percentage they need to pay. So we said, hey, why don't we create a Joint Benefits Authority within a city to create this green infrastructure? So we've just raised some money for a pilot in San Francisco that hopefully will come to be. And the future vision here is that if that happens, there are literally billions of dollars of municipal spending that could go through these types of joint benefits authority, which can also issue bonds. So they can actually raise money from the private sector. So we could be creating a whole new part of the municipal bond market aimed at green infrastructure, stormwater management, what have you. And the concept could be applied in 100 other ways in places that are not municipalities and in ways that don't have to do with stormwater. So
We could even fix potholes.
maybe. Don't get too crazy.
Oh, sorry, I know you could talk forever, but we might take one more question and then wrap it up. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, there's a desal plant that's happening in Marina, and that's going to cause that is proposed, but there's I don't know how the sewer system is going to connect to that. Some people are saying, the businesses are saying it's a good idea. Others, the majority of people are saying it's not a good idea because it's going to cause a seawater intrusion. And
This is here?
yes,
Yeah, just up the coast.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked to a couple of municipalities about that kind of thing in a bunch of different places, not here, but in LA. we've been trying to work with LA to do something like this joint benefit authority and to trying to figure out how do we address some of the issues of water in LA. And they also have a big saltwater intrusion problem in some of their into some of their aquifers, and figuring out how to keep the pressure high as part of why they pump water down. We've seen some of the investment structures that have been set up for some of these desal plants. I think the key problem with desal is that it is expensive per gallon of water, very expensive, like several orders of magnitude more expensive than a lot of other things you could do. I think we're better off doing, drinking sewer water than doing desal in many ways. I think we're better off doing all kinds of other things, protecting forests upstream to get more water downstream than desal. But there are communities that have told me, no, you're misunderstanding why we're doing desal. So take San Diego. They're like, we did desal not just for the water, but because if there's an earthquake, most of our water comes from outside San Diego. And if that aqueduct gets impacted, we're royally screwed. So we're willing to pay 3x per gallon of water for desal as an insurance mechanism for, our own self-reliance in the case of a sort of catastrophic failure of the aqueduct systems that are feeding us most of our water. I don't know if that's a similar problem here, but from an investment perspective, these things have not been great just because they are extremely expensive and the permitting is, they're cheaper, better ways to get water. To give you another idea, look, there is a huge arbitrage opportunity in water happening now, and I hesitate to even say this, but agricultural districts in the Colorado River Basin pay basically $20 an acre foot, maybe $40 an acre foot. LA is willing to pay $1,500 an acre foot for that same water. We have the way to move that water to LA. That transaction has only happened a few times when LA has actually bought land and taken it out of agricultural production and moved the water to LA. So there are much cheaper ways to get water, and desal is probably twice that an acre foot, but I don't know what the actual prices are. Not to mention you have all the problems you're talking about of what do you do with the saline brine, and how does that impact the ecosystems once you've pulled the salt out, and where do you put it, and how do you handle that? So I think we'd be silly to, unless you have an issue like San Diego where you're trying to basically create an insurance pool of water in case a catastrophe happens. I think places like Monterey or San Francisco should look elsewhere for.
All of our aquifer lines come out of the Sierra, straight across the Hayward Fault or any of the other major faults. So to the extent San Diego has a quake problem, we all have a quake problem.
Yeah.
Bay Areas.
Every one of those aquifer lines comes straight across those faults.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the issue of San Francisco, it's not as big a problem as San Diego because, in the case of San Diego, most of those are actually man-made aquifers. In the case of San Francisco, you've got the Sacramento River that is basically channeling chunks of that. But yes, the aquifer system in California and the aqueduct system in California is a huge bone of contention right now in lots of different ways. I have a friend who's trying to set up cover the aqueducts with solar, which I actually thought was an interesting idea because you limit the evaporation rates of the water and you also get the energy. And since I think it's 33% of the energy in California goes to moving water, it could solve a huge portion of the problem. I mean, when you think about it, we've actually created aqueducts that go from the Sacramento, San Joaquin Valley all the way down to LA, pumping that water over mountain systems. It's a crazy system. I'm sorry, did I answer your question?
Yes.
To some degree.
So with that, we might, we could be here all night, but you could probably talk on it, but I think our students need to.
Yeah, they got
But it's fascinating conversation, Ricardo, and really, really interesting work that you're doing. So please, everyone, join me in. And, I'm sure our students would be interested in talking to you about internship opportunities and encourage capital.